This session is about some work we've been doing to drill into the Humanise Principles that look at how we can practically change things for the better. And as someone said this morning, not to let the human perspective fall off the table. I think this is a helpful tool that we can all use to guide conversations in all the different parts of our life around development. But I think most particularly, it's think about the developers and the role they have, maybe quite not, as we've just heard, at the top of the chain, but very close to the decision-making heart of the chain, maybe deciding what it is they want to do and then looking for the finance, then putting the teams together and then assembling all of the other skills, having the conversations with Historic England. So we think they're a kind of a key point and a key group to be working with. We obviously know that not all developers are the same. There are very different types of developers out there. We've got some in the room today and we've got lots who are not in the room today. So let's think about what they might all need. So my starting point, let me see if I can get this to work, is that I don't think anyone intends to build boring buildings that make people feel miserable or unsafe. I think they're just not thinking in the right way about what's going on. They've become often slightly too focused on things that are not personal, that are not human, and things have become slightly too measured and metricized. I've seen in my career this become much more of an extreme thing, and I think we need to remind everyone what we need back on the table. I think if we asked all developers, would you want to create buildings that make people happy? They would all say yes, but their version of yes is very different. So we want to think about what the tool is that will do this. And we know it doesn't happen. We know from experience that there are thousands of tiny little pushes that make development go in a particular direction. Sometimes there's also a lack of curiosity and a skewed value system that measures and values some things above others. And we've heard today quite a bit about human measurement and measurement of impact on humans not being the thing that perhaps is getting enough of a say. So this is about a toolkit. Primarily, it's about the passerby, often the customer of the developers, sometimes the direct customer, sometimes the indirect customer, and to focus on how we can create a toolkit using the Humanise Principles that gets people thinking in the right way, that gives people questions they can ask, that gets people into the discussion and thinking a little bit differently than how they might ordinarily arrive at the table. We need to have people in the room that can push back against I desperately need my M&E grate to take the whole of the street frontage. Well, maybe you don't. We desperately need to push back against UKPN deciding they need a massive plain concrete forecourt in front of the building so that nothing else can happen. And I think through having these conversations about people, we can start to do that. The other thing we quite often see is tensions between a number of good and useful and necessary things all pushing back against each other. And quite often it's the things that we can count, it's the things that we can measure that win, and not the things that are human. And I think we need to rebalance that in particular. So this whole tool is about making sure that people-centred or humanised design, as we might call it, doesn't get lost along the way. So what we're trying to do here is to create a simple tool, as a little toolkit for developers to help them start the conversations inside those organisations, the conversations they have with others, the language they use in their briefs, and the whole process of talking to all the different stakeholders through starting with an idea and delivering, managing, running and operating a project and how that works. The question about why developers, I think we've covered, but I think they have a really key role, and I want to make sure that they've got the tools and an understanding that we all have about how difficult the job is, but that I think we're all here to help. So over the past few months, we've been pulling apart the Humanise Principles, thinking about what the outputs are of this process, thinking about this tool. So what I'm going to go through is what we've set up is something that talks about what the 5 principles mean practically, how we might know if they're working, how we might know if they're not working, why we need them, why we need to bother, and some ideas about how we are suggesting they could be applied in practical project situations. I think this is exactly about the belonging, the participation and the well-being we've heard about through all the sessions this morning. So the 5 Humanise Principles, if people haven't seen them before, cover a broad range of areas around how developers work, but it's not the language that people often use. It's not the language that you're often hearing in communications with developers, in project teams, in conversations with planners and in conversations with others. In order to break down the 5 principles, we've split them into 2 groups. The first 2 we see being about the mindset and the overall approach of the organisation. It's about how businesses are run, what they value and how they operate as organisations. And these 2 principles are emotion as a function, which I will explain later, public conversations. Then there are 3 further principles which are slightly more project-based, and in terms of how we use them, they ask fundamental questions and help us think about particular projects or particular things that we might be working on. And these 3 principles are visual complexity, door, street and city scales, and 1,000-year thinking. So I'm going to talk you through what we think each of these are, why they're important, and then how to use them. As an aside, we've also been looking at how these principles map to planning policy and what there is out there already that uses the kind of language and the intention we think that planning means to have, but somehow is slightly lost. We've identified places in the National Planning Policy Framework and the National Design Guide that people can use to say, this is why we should be using this principle, and to use that as a way into the conversation with partners perhaps who don't really understand that this is something that is not different, it's not other, it's something that we should all be doing. So the first principle, emotion as a function. So I think this is about seeing emotion as a part of what we do in making buildings or place. Firstly, it's about recognising it in the development process. Now, I don't know how many people here work in development, but how many times have you actually had a conversation about emotion? It won't be very many times, I don't think, for most people. There are conversations around it. You might talk about belonging, or well-being is definitely a very common word, but not necessarily the wider gamut of emotions that buildings and places create. So we know that buildings make us feel a range of things. Very simply, these feelings impact on how we behave, and as we've heard this morning, how stressed we get and how much we feel we belong. Also, how interested we are, how much time we want to spend somewhere. And we don't all feel the same way in a given situation, but that's the really interesting bit. It's rarely talked about in the development process, thinking about, I want people to feel safe, but of course we want everyone to feel safe. It doesn't always happen. I want people to feel surprise. Actually, how many times have people heard that as a thing that you might want to create out of development or out of a building? We definitely might want people to feel calm walking along a street. And I think some of the talks this morning were about different ways that visual stimuli might help evoke that calmness. So this principle is about getting comfortable with talking about the impacts of buildings in emotional terms in order to avoid the negative consequences. It's really important to us and to developers because people want to spend time in places that make them feel good, that make them feel welcomed and where they belong, and places that feel safe. And developers need customers, directly or indirectly, in order to make their financial return. And those customers are more likely to be there if they like how the place and the building feels. The emotional drivers of buildings and place are also ways of checking in through the process and what we've built afterwards. They're really good questions that we can work with stakeholders, residents, passers-by to ask them how actually something has worked and what it does. I think it's also good to ask the question, who is staying away? Who's not there? Who haven't we succeeded in bringing to this place and who feels excluded? The next question, if I'm in the right place. No, we've got onto the why. I think I've missed a slide. If we think about the how then, the how do we have these conversations? How do we get into ourselves into a place where we can happily discuss in our teams how we want buildings to make people feel happy, joyful, calm, safe, and to consider the wide range of different people about this in a way that's practically useful to both us and them. We're suggesting 3 ideas to help get this principle embedded into projects and as ways of talking about how buildings make us feel. The first is to start talking about the place before you start the project, which I think is the process that Mike was describing. Have conversations with people, understand what's important to them, and think about what it is they associate with the place, the building, the site that you're working with. This approach means we understand more about where and who we're working with, and it also demonstrates our commitment to listening. The second, how, is to think about making some practical interventions into a project that root the building in the place. What have you learnt from the history? Which bits of the building will passers-by, users be closest to? Thinking about building some of those practical interventions that are rooted in that place into the building, into the texture, the materials. It might be public art, it might be working with local craftspeople, but it's something that's about the conversations you've had, the local history, or key people. The third, how, we've suggested, is about understanding whether emotional responses you plan for are working and have been delivered, both along the way, so talking to people through the design process, but also once it's finished, very much as a form of post-occupancy evaluation that values human response. Most of the questions in most POE aren't about that. The second Humanise principle is about who we talk to and what about. And it's about having conversations broadly, not being afraid to talk to people, and thinking about how buildings and place affect people in the way that we do that. These conversations need to be genuine and may at times be contested and quite tricky. But to make better buildings, we need to bring public confidence in the potential of development to benefit everyone off the floor, which is kind of where it is now. By talking to people, we can also give confidence, grow trust, and show people they have a voice. We need to demonstrate that we are listening and that those conversations have impact. The reason why it's important is because the strength of a story of a place is a powerful determinant of its success. We all know that places rooted in the history and community they're in are better accepted and people feel more positive about them. People also feel more positive if they know someone who's been involved. It may not even be them. It might be someone in their family, their friends, their wider circle. It values the connections that we make, both directly and indirectly. One of the other problems can be that the passerby doesn't have an obvious place in these conversations at the moment. And unless they are happy to respond to a planning consultation, not everybody is, they're very rarely asked what they think. We talk to neighbours, we talk to those impacted, but often not those who are passing by. So that's something else we need to think about. And the key point here is building trust through these conversations, right back to why we need change and how developers and those that make change present themselves and be seen. So many of us know and work with the theory of how we engage with communities and work with them, but is there something about having a clear structure to this conversation and making sure it can be more than just, what do you think? Here's a proposal, let's talk about it. I know that's not how all engagement conversations go. So we've suggested here, and let me just check I've got the right, yes, got the right slide up, 4 stages around how to do this. And the first one is the how is engage early. As we heard earlier, before we start the design, be open and listen. The second is about starting with a story of a building or place. We've heard about the site history and how important that is, and how it's really affected things like the Mayfield project, but also make it compelling, make the story something that people feel involved in, that relates to them. Think carefully about where the community can have a direct impact on the outcome, and where they can have more specific involvement to shape things. This doesn't mean they get to decide everything, but it does mean they might get to have some say, some input on some parts of it. In addition, it's also important that developer organisations, and actually all of us, are part of the wider debate and discussion around change and why we need it, and change and where it needs to happen. This one is tricky, but it's critical, because confidence is very low in development at the moment, and we need to help change that. And I think these people in the room are a very good place to start. The third principle is about visual complexity, and back to making sure we have buildings that catch the eye and that are not boring or dull. We're referring here to the way we create texture in buildings and interest in buildings that wear well, and there were some really interesting talks about that this morning. Things that catch our eye, things that make us look at them. It's not about, I don't think it's about one style being right or wrong or any prescribed solutions, but it is about particular buildings in that place and what that place needs. It's important to understand that it's not necessarily for all of the elements of a building to be complex and richly detailed. It's the contrast with simplicity in the overall composition that often makes particular features interesting and stand out, drawing attention and making people curious. Why we need this? Well, it matters because it makes buildings feel distinct and special, and it supports the role and function of buildings and uses in their place. The amount of visual complexity in the way it's arranged helps us actually understand our environment. It makes it more legible. They make places where people want to spend time. We've also heard that visual complexity is a health issue. It affects mood and stress levels. It helps create mutual trust, willingness to help strangers, exercise mobility, are all encouraged by the way buildings look and the way we feel that we want to spend time as we pass them or as we look at them. People's happiness and their physical and mental health are affected by what sort of buildings that we're looking at. This is very big stuff. In terms of how, the toolkit is suggesting 3 things that we do around visual complexity, and the first one is very simple: make buildings interesting. That might seem a little bit obvious, but we can come back to this, that I don't think anyone goes out of their way to say, I'm going to make a really boring building today, but somehow we end up with them. So actually reminding yourself at every point and using the test, maybe it needs to be one of Ruth's cards that says, is this an interesting building? And you have that on your desk at all times. You take it to all meetings. Maybe that's the thing that we all need. Make a building interesting is the first one. The second one is about celebrating stories through patterns and ornament, relating back both to the public conversations, the emotion as a function. This means using these principles together to make buildings that are visually stimulating, but have local relevance. The third one is about the texture and detail that's critical to the building. It's built into the brief and it's ring-fenced in the budget. It was interesting when Mike was talking about how they added a lot of detail without increasing the cost in the budget. I'm assuming that was by taking away in some places and giving back in others. Working really hard. This is not easy stuff. But we need to make sure that what doesn't happen is the costs are too high. Someone says, no, we don't need that detail. We'll take that out. That is the thing that can't happen. Principle 4 is about the rules that help us understand the scales of the city and how we experience them. Sometimes this has been called the Humanise rule, but now we're calling it in this toolkit the door, street and city scales. These 3 scales relate to how passers-by and the public see and experience buildings in different ways. Each one is really important in its own right and covers the key ways we experience buildings and often issues that those stakeholders we talk to are interested in. They might not be interested in all of them, but in different ways people are. So the first scale is the door scale, which is visible when you approach up close around 2 meters away. The ground floor of a building is one of the most important things, I think, to worry about. If that works, we've got a long way to making buildings that are successful. Street scale is about how you experience a building from across or down the street, how you might see it with other buildings. Is it drawing your attention? Is it supposed to be drawing your attention? Is it part of a wider group? How does it make you feel? But thinking about the street scale, so how it relates to others, is critically important. And then the third scale is about how a building is seen from a distance as part of the city, and particularly its silhouette and on the skyline. These three scales are important because they contribute directly to a strong sense of place, familiarity and belonging. And we need to think about all three scales for a building to work well. They can increase footfall, value and long-term success. And they are often key conversations with planners. I also think they're useful because they bring the passerby into the conversation. So, in terms of how, we've suggested in the toolkit some ways that we might do this in these three scales. At the door scale, let me check I'm on the right slide, we want people to take a moment and to appreciate the detail and to feel invited, to feel welcome. That doesn't necessarily mean into the building, but just being welcome near and next to a building. Our eyes appreciate the texture at this distance. We can see the signage, we understand what's going on. At street scale, we want people to feel good as they walk past the building. The coherence of the street, the consistency of the street level are important. The way entrances and frontages and activity work together has a strong impact on that experience. I think the exercise we were doing earlier, looking at that building, I think that the street level is definitely the question for that one. And at the city scale, we want to stitch the building or development back into the city. This is thinking about the roof line, the built form, the shape, as well as whether something is like or unlike its neighbours. I don't necessarily have a view that things should all be alike each other or all different. It depends what's the right answer in that place out of that process. So there isn't a right answer, there isn't a wrong answer. But what I think we do know is that good design cannot be driven purely by numbers, purely by people deciding on the inside there's a certain level of efficiency that leads to an outcome on the outside. This leads to something that's often quite unsatisfactory, and the generosity is just not there in what those buildings can offer. The fifth principle, which is the one that I think is often the most discussed one when we talk about this with different people, is about long term. It's about what happens after we're gone. It's about the impact and what we have now and what comes later, and sometimes much, much, much later. We think of buildings being relatively permanent things. They're quite expensive things, they cost a lot of money, and they can last hundreds of years. But actually, in the scale of human existence, in the scale of the planet, we're thinking pretty short term. Planning policy often works on a 10 to 20 year cycle. Most buildings are planned for a 60 to 80 year cycle, but we kind of know that they have the potential to last longer. But what if we think centuries forward? What if we think about being deliberate and about understanding our long-term impacts? I think we need to look at this in two ways. Through a technical and material lens, the fact that we're using these materials now, what does that mean on whether they're available or usable in the future? How are we making buildings that are long life, loose fit? Are they flexible to change without needing perhaps such a deep retrofit that I think it might be a misuse of the term, and we have seen that. But also importantly, a social and cultural perspective. This might include street pattern, frontage, skyline, landmarks, materials, and places that might march through. I couldn't quite find a picture of a building that was 1,000 years old, but I found the one that was 700 years old that was still in use today, and people pass through just as part of their use of the city. Creating buildings that age gracefully is really important and have strong bones. We need to think about robust and enduring materials, particularly facades. We all see what happens when this doesn't happen, when buildings look terrible in a pretty short time. And we need to think about different types of value. Short-term financial value may not be the best assessment if we're also thinking about how buildings might be used and the other kinds of value we've just been talking about. So why is this important? Well, it leads to better decisions and outcomes across a range of topics. It means considering the needs of future generations and the planet, and it supports the narrative for physical building playing a role in a wide range of long-term ambitions. I think it's also about, and this idea has come up a number of times, designing the heritage buildings of the future. Which are the buildings that people will really love and they want to keep and they value and they want to tell stories to their children and their grandchildren about? But ultimately, 1,000-year thinking ensures greater investment resilience over the long term. It's not just building, it's also stewardship, it's also culture. So what are our tools for doing this in the toolkit? So the first one is about thinking of yourself as a custodian in a relatively short part of a long history of a building or site. Our involvement is relatively short, but we can think long term. What will happen after you're no longer around? What do you want to happen? What do you think should happen? What will happen if you don't plan for it, if you just let this completely go to chance? We think it's important to establish and communicate your intentions through the conversations you have with a wider public and the communities, and understanding even why development is needed. That's part of this 1,000-year conversation. Why is change needed now? Why did the thing that was on that site before fail or not do its job? How do we stop that happening in the future? And the fourth point is around really capturing and adding to the distinctive character of the place. Very few buildings are an island, and the impact on their neighbours and people, and we need to add something to the wider story as part of what we do. So that is the end of the principles, which I won't go through in detail again because we've seen those. But the question is now, what next? What do we need to do? We need, and I think everyone in this room is in this group, we need to start this conversation. We need to be talking to people about these principles. We need to be not afraid to bring up things that might make us feel a little bit uncomfortable in situations where no one wants to talk about emotion because they want to talk about the cost plan or they want to talk about a bit of research. We need to understand why human value and the way places feel is actually all of our job. We have to get comfortable with thinking in this way and to bring people in alongside the metrics. If we've got measures of doing that, that is super helpful too. But we can all start these conversations, and I think we should just get on with it. So hopefully you can all have a look at the toolkit and see how you might use it.